Anyway, let me give you some background on me, because this is the first time I'm here. My name is Evan Weiner. I am a journalist by trade. I've done radio in Rockland County. This is where I started out in 1971 on WRKL radio. I went to Spring Valley High School, and we did a program on WRKL every Tuesday afternoon at 3:45 called Tiger Talk. It was the worst radio show ever. It was about Spring Valley High School. I also worked at WGRC when that was in existence in Nanuet. And thanks to WGRC, I ended up on WNEW radio. Remember William B. Williams and Make Believe Ballroom? Well, I was doing some news for them in 1978. Thanks to something that happened up in Nyack, the Tappan Zee Townhouse in those days. The Democrats had a statewide fundraiser, and well, a bunch of people were there, including Hugh Carey, the governor, Mario Cuomo. The other people who were there, Patrick Moynihan, he was running for Senate, and this tall guy who used to be a mayor somewhere, sandy blonde-haired guy, tall guy, good-looking guy, really good-looking guy, and he comes up to me and he says, I want to tell you something, and here I am, I'm 21 years old, I got this frizzy hair and all, and he says, I like you, I want to tell you something. I said, I know who you are, so I watch Batman, you're Mayor Lindsay. Who's John Lindsay? Told me that he was running for Senate, state of New York in 1980, and I had the scoop. And I ended up on WNEW radio thanks to John Lindsay. I was 21 years old at the time. So my whole background has been radio, TV, newspapers, magazine, and covering a lot of politics, an awful lot of politics. And then I went into speaking as well because somebody said, you know a lot of stories. You should tell them. I said, fine, that's what I should do. But anyway, we're here in the calendar year 2022. And yet, these are my in-laws back in 1948, 74 years ago, when their whole lives were, married lives anyway, were ahead of them. But sometimes I wonder about 1948 and 2022 because, bear with me for a second, 1948 or now? Now, North Korea is still a problem. North Korea becomes a problem in 1948. 1948, Israel. Israel becomes a nation in 1948. Still problems today, 74 years later. Oh, Arab-Israeli wars, they go back to 1948. Things still haven't been settled. Now, or 1948? The United States against the USSR, except today it's the United States against Russia. Czechoslovakia, well, it's the Cold War, they become communist. The presidential race of that year, Harry Truman, he was supposed to lose. Thomas Dewey, the New York State governor, was supposed to beat Harry Truman. And there's Harry Truman with the Chicago Daily Tribune. Newspaper headline, the Chicago Tribune headline, Dewey defeats Truman. Gandhi was assassinated. World Health Organization, in the news almost every day because of COVID-19. It was the World Health Organization that declared the COVID-19 pandemic 2 years ago. They were formed in 1948. Contempt of Congress. People went before Congress, refused to answer questions, just refused. Well, these guys, there are 10 of them. They're Hollywood writers and directors, and they refuse to tell Congress about communists in Hollywood. They end up in jail. Apartheid, South Africa, that's starting in 1948. And how many of you used to watch the Ed Sullivan Show? Did you like Sullivan? My cousin was Jerry Stiller. Remember Stiller and Mirror? You don't recall them, Stiller and Mirror? They were on 36 times. 36 times on the show. And by the way, in this picture, that's Jerry Lewis right there. Martin and Lewis, who were the tops of the tops at that point in the United States and the world. They were one of the first guests on Toast to the Town. North Korea is established, and North Korea continues continued to be a problem for the United States and the world. And here they are. It's the beginning of North Korea. By the way, North Korea is in the news today because they claim they have their first case of COVID-19, and they're isolating everybody in North Korea. It's established in 1948. In 1910, Japan formally annexed the Korean Peninsula, which had been occupied following the Russian-Japanese War. Over the next 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, there was colonial rule by the Japanese in Korea. The country was modernized by the Japanese and industrialized significantly, but it was a brutal, brutal regime. And there are books about the Japanese raping Korean women, among other things. But there's this guy here, Kim Il-sung. He's supposed to be some sort of god. He really wasn't. He was a Russian soldier at one point. But the Kim family is still running Korea after all these years, 74 years. Kim was the son of parents who fled to Manchuria during his childhood to escape the Japanese rule of Korea. He attended elementary school in Manchuria, and while a student, he joins the Communist Youth Organization. He's arrested for his activities, and he's in jail between 1929 and 1930. Well, he's released from prison, and he decides to go underground, the guerrilla resistance against the Japanese occupation, and he adopted the name of a Korean guerrilla fighter against Japan. The name Kim Il-sung. Of course, his grandson is running Korea today. 1930s, he fought against the Japanese who were occupying Korea. And the Soviets, Stalin looked at him, and Stalin liked him. And they sent him to the Soviet Union because they were training him militarily and politically. He was a communist, and he fights for the Soviet Red Army in World War II. And that is North Korea, back in 1948. During World War II, Japan sent many Korean men to the front as soldiers against the United States, or forced them to work in wartime factories, while thousands of young Korean women were known as comfort women because they provided sexual services to Japanese soldiers. Following the drop of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and overrunning the Korean Peninsula by U.S. and Soviet forces, the Japanese would eventually surrender to the Allied forces on August 15, 1945, and that was the end of Japan and Korea. Japan would formally surrender to the United States on September 2nd, 1945. And here are some of the people returning to Korea after the war. 1945, Soviet troops start occupying the north end of Korea. 1945, U.S. troops start occupying the south end of Korea. We have any Korean war vets in here? Anybody who served in Korea?
No, my husband.
Your husband did. Your husband did. Well, he would know the history then of why he was there. And why was he there? It starts in 1945. 1946, the North Korean Communist Party, called the Korean Work Party, inaugurated Soviet-backed leadership installed, and the guy who's installed is Kim Il-sung, whose grandson, of course, runs Korea today. The original plan, let's unify the two countries, and I'm sure your husband would have liked to have seen the unified countries so he didn't have to be there. But North Korea said, we're the true Korea. And they stood firm while the Southern Koreans, or the South Koreans, capitulated to the Japanese and then to U.S. powers. The people of South Korea elect a government in May of 1948, 74 years ago this month, and they create the Republic of Korea, while the North said, we're not going to be any part of this. On September 9th, 1948, Soviet-backed communists in North Korea created the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, and Kim is the leader. And it would be a communist government, and it would be the provisional government until the two Koreas would unite. The Democratic People's Party of Korea was established in Pyongyang by Kim. He was a communist dictator. He controlled everything in Korea, as his grandson does today. The Republic of Korea was proclaimed, its capital would be in Seoul, and it was under this guy, Syngman Rhee, who would be the head of South Korea. He's a nationalist. He's a Christian. He forms a Korean exile government during the Japanese occupation, and he's elected the president of South Korea. The Soviets were wildly popular with the bulk of the North Koreans' labor and peasant population, but the middle-class Koreans wanted no part of the Soviets, and they flee south, below the 38th parallel, which is still in contention today. The two Koreas are foreign. The creation of Israel is in 1948. But you gotta go back to 1917, the Balfour Declaration, England. And they're the ones who are controlling the Middle East. I have a friend, or had a friend, by the name of Shelley Saltman. You can't hear me, Shelley. Wherever you are, put down the burner phone. 15 years from now, we'll talk. Anyway, his cousin, Matti, put together the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. Why was Israel created? Well, part of it was the Holocaust after World War II, and England didn't know what to do with the Middle East. They had absolutely no clue what to do with it. They're there, the Arabs are there, the Jews are pouring into the Middle East, and England is like, okay, what are we supposed to do now? Oh, by the way, there are terrorist attacks against the English by Jewish radicals who would eventually be running the country. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations voted to allow the creation of Israel. It had been 3 decades after the Balfour, or the British Mandate for Palestine. The United States, or rather the United Nations and the United States, proposed to split the area into two. There'd be an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state. The Jewish people said, yeah, we'll take it. We'll take it. Sounds great to us. We're going to establish a homeland. Arabs, not so much. In fact, they rejected it. Under the resolution, the area of religious significance surrounding Jerusalem would remain under international control, administered by the United Nations. Palestinian Arabs refused to recognize this arrangement. They said, hey, wait a minute. This is in favor of the Jews. This doesn't help us at all. And it's unfair to the Arab population that would remain in the territory under the partition. The United States is looking to play both ends. They're looking to appease the Arabs and appease the Jews. It's still the stated policy 75 years later, almost 75 years later, that there's a two-state solution. There'll be an Arab state and there'll be a Jewish state. The United States under Harry Truman, the President of the United States, encouraged negotiations between Arabs and Jews in the Middle East. Truman would ultimately support the creation of Israel, as did the Soviet Union dictator, Joseph Stalin. And here is a Torah that David Ben-Gurion is presenting to the United States President Harry Truman following the creation of Israel. The United Nations resolution sparked conflict between Jewish and Arab groups within Palestine. Fighting began with attacks by a regular band of Palestinian Arabs attached to local units of the Arab Liberation Army, and which was volunteers from Palestine and neighboring Arab countries. Stop me if you think anything has changed, or is it still the same since 1947-48? These groups launched attacks against Jewish cities, settlements, and armed forces. Creation of Israel. The forces, the Jewish forces, composed of Haganah, which is the underground militia of the Jewish community in Palestine, and two small groups, one called the Irgun and the other the Lehi, or the Lehi. The goal of the Arabs was initially to block the partition resolution and to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state. The Jews, on the other hand, hoped to gain control over the territory allotted to them under the partition plan, the creation of Israel. It's almost 74 years to the date. The British situation in Palestine was deteriorating. They had ruled under a mandate that the League of Nations said, you're fine to do, 1922. But the Brits were having all kinds of problems just administering to all the needs of the Middle East, of India, of Pakistan, and in some areas in Africa. They were overextended. The British government gave up the mandate and announced that it would formally withdraw from the Middle East, or at least those territories, on midnight on May 14th. May 13th, the British High Commissioner General Sir Alan Cunningham broadcast a farewell message. He said to the sides, be moderate, try to find a solution to your problems. And there is Sir Alan Gordon Cunningham. On May 14th, he leaves the government house in Jerusalem. He reviews an honor guard of 50 men of the Highland Light Infantry, the last British troops in the country. He flies to Haifa. He takes a salute from the detachment of the Palestinian police, shakes hands with both the Jewish mayor of Haifa and the Arab deputy mayor, and at midnight, he's gone. Israel is in his rear-view mirror, and that is David Ben Gurion. 4 o'clock that afternoon, David Ben Gurion, announced the formation of the State of Israel. First independent Jewish state in 19 centuries of history. And he read out the proclamation. By virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people, and by resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, we hereby proclaim the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel. And let the partying start. Except there was no time for partying. Absolutely no time for partying, because the first Arab-Israeli war starts almost immediately in 1948. 5 armies from Egypt, Transjordan, which is now Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, invaded the new state that night looking to destroy the country. Guess where the Jews got help? Czechoslovakia and France. Czechoslovakia sends arms to the Jews in their struggle against the Arabs, as does France. The stated purpose of the Arab invasion was to restore law and order in light of the British withdrawal. The Israelis, meanwhile, won control of the main road to Jerusalem through the Yehuda Heights, or the hills of Judea, and successfully repelled repeated Arab attacks, thanks to Matti Saltzman, Shelley's cousin, who helped. Do you know who else was there? How many of you know William Shatner?
I heard of him. He's an ex-sportsman.
No, William Shatner was on Star Trek. Mordechai Shatner was one of the Israeli freedom fighters. One, I believe it was his uncle. He was there as well. I gave that talk about 12, 13 years ago in 5 towns in Long Island. And there was an Israeli freedom fighter there who relocated to Long Island. And he said to me, and to the others in the group, he said, I didn't know if we were going to have a country after 24 hours. But they held on. At the war's end, Egypt gained control of the Gaza Strip. Jordan annexed the West Bank. What are 2 of the main problems today? Gaza Strip, West Bank. Nothing has been resolved in 74 years. The Israelis prevailed in what became to be known as the War of Independence. But the war was a heavy cost because 1% of the Jewish population died in the war. In the Arab world, it became to be known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Catastrophe. I only do this for a living, right? Because of the large number of refugees and displaced persons resulting from the war. 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or left, or they got caught up in the fighting. Large numbers stayed in Israel and became full citizens with equal rights. And the others who left, well, they were given perpetual refugee status in Arab states. It has not changed in 74 years. That is still going on. 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries, and they ended up in their new home, Israel. There's also problems. The Cold War. Well, Truman and Stalin could agree on the formation of Israel, but they could not agree what was going on in Germany. After World War II, the big three, Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, in February '45, in Yalta said, we're going to split up. We're going to split this thing up into 4 sectors. It's going to be the Soviet sector, English sector, French sector, American sector. And he said to Germany, we're not accepting anything except unconditional surrender, which they got. By the time there's the next meeting in the Crimea in the summer of 1945, Roosevelt's dead. Churchill is replaced by Attlee as the Prime Minister of England, and there still is Stalin. And they come up with this idea, this is how we're going to split up Germany. But Berlin was split up, but Berlin was in East Germany. So this is a problem. So the Soviets decide, well, we're going to have a blockade. We're going to block everything. There was a lack of consensus with the Soviet on the future of Germany, led by the United States, Great Britain, and France. And how do you get all of these occupied zones into one single independent state? Couldn't do it. It took decades before it became one single state. In December 1946, they took steps to do so, but the Soviet Union didn't want Western zones in the country to unify under a democratic, pro-capitalist government. The Soviet Union also feared that a united West Berlin located entirely within the Soviet sector would cause them problems. 3 days after Western allies authorized the introduction of a new currency in West Germany, the Deutsche Mark, Stalin ordered all the land and water routes to the western zones of the city of Berlin to be cut off in June of 1947. Hoping to starve western parts of the city into submission, the Berlin blockade was also the test of the emerging U.S. policy of containment. And here is the airlift. I assume nobody here was in the airlift, but bringing supplies into Berlin. Unwilling to abandon Berlin, the United States, Great Britain, and France began to deliver all needed supplies to West Berlin by air. By 1948, there would be the Marshall Plan. It would also be known as the European Recovery Program, a program providing aid to Europe following the destruction of Europe, of a lot of Europe in World War II. This starts in 1948. $15 billion go back into Europe to start rebuilding things on the continent. The U.S. Secretary of State was George C. Marshall, and it's a 4-year plan to reconstruct cities, industries, infrastructure, damaged during the war, and to remove trade barriers between European neighbors, as well as foster commerce between those countries and the United States. Truman signs the Marshall Plan into effect on April 3rd, and 16 nations get American aid, including Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, West Germany, and Norway. Well, they're helping out, except Czechoslovakia goes communist. Anybody with relatives in Czechoslovakia over the years? You had relatives? Did they get out? Did they eventually get out? After the war, they got out. I met a few people like that. On February 25th, under pressure from the Czechoslovakian Communist Party President Edvard Beneš, communist dominated government begins to organize. The Soviet Union wasn't there. They didn't interfere as they would in 1968. So it was a bloodless communist coup, an example of Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe. There were rigged elections in May to validate the communist victory. Beneš resigned, and his former foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, died under very suspicious circumstances. The United States and Great Britain denounced the communist seizure of power, but neither one of them took direct action, which meant there's another hot spot in the Cold War. There is a little bit of bright news for Harry Truman. The dictator in Yugoslavia, Tito, and Joseph Stalin have a fallout, partly over what was going on with the Greek Civil War. The Communist Information Bureau, a movement that brought together all European communist and socialist states at the time, passed a resolution against the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, citing presence of nationalist elements in Yugoslavia, and they were thrown out. And this would harm the Soviet and Yugoslavian relationship. Well, not too far up the road from here is the Thomas E. Dewey Thruway, right? Named after Thomas Dewey, who was the governor of New York in the 1940s, who unsuccessfully ran for president in 1944, but all the political pundits were all guaranteed that Thomas Dewey was going to be the next president of the United States because Harry Truman was such a failure. Well, Truman has these problems. In 1946, the Democrats do not do well in the midterm elections. The Republicans take control of the Senate and the House for the first time since 1928, prior to the Depression. And the pundits are all out there saying, ain't no way Harry Truman's going to win. Can't happen. Not going to happen. Public opinion poll, 1947, 37% of those asked said, hey, Harry's doing a good job, leave him alone. 65% said no. In 1947, Truman gets to work. Remember, Truman wasn't elected. He was the president after Franklin Roosevelt died back in April of 1945. So he works hard to build support for his candidacy among the Democratic Party. Labor was a problem. 1946, the guys come home from war, and they go back to their jobs, and they're striking all over the place. There's strikes all over the place because people want more money, and the men are saying, listen, we put our lives on the line for America. Give us some money. We deserve it. Companies out there, you wouldn't be in business if we didn't put our lives on the line. Well, a lot of people didn't see it that way. 1946, there were a lot of strikes. 1947, Congress decides we're going to take care of these strikes. We're going to stick it to the workers. Taft-Hartley Act. Truman vetoed it, but the Taft-Hartley Act, which restricted the power of unions, still to this day is in effect. And then 1948, Truman desegregates the military, and he comes out in favor of civil rights. And also, he thinks that Americans should have national health care, universal health care, higher minimum wage, federal housing measures. The liberals want that. And Truman's working with the liberals to get it. And also, he's got the Cold War. He's got the Iron Curtain. And he has an anti-Soviet foreign policy. And Americans who have roots in Eastern Europe and anti-communist liberals are saying, this is great. Harry, give them help. Harry would give them help. That would be his slogan. 1948 election. In May 1948, he gets the Jewish vote. Why? Israel should be a state. And that solidifies his relationship with American Jews. And he becomes kind of this uncle or grandfather. He's more relaxed. He's folksy. And yeah, he starts telling stories. And also there's some fiery speeches. And he starts attacking the Republicans. Midway through 1948, it's not really working all that much. His popularity isn't all that high. It starts working. Why? Because this guy is a terrible candidate. As Theodore Roosevelt once said, he looked like, on the wedding cake, he looked like the groom on the wedding cake during getting married. Republicans nominated Dewey, New York governor, and for vice president, Earl Warren, California governor. Dewey had run against FDR in 1944, lost a close race. He was young, he was popular, and he was progressive. Strongly anti-communist, he was an internationalist in foreign affairs. Domestic issues, he was a critic of the New Deal. Yeah, the deal that brought you Social Security, that kind of deal. Republicans didn't like that back in 1948. He liked it because how it came about during the Depression, disliked it. He kind of liked Social Security. In fact, most politicians like Social Security. They know they touch it, it's the third rail. They're going to get burnt, unless they really don't care. On February 2nd, 1948, Congress was asked by Harry Truman to support a civil rights package. Federal protection against lynching. Federal protection against lynching. Better protection of the right to vote. Does that sound like something you've been hearing lately? Better protection for the right to vote? 74 years ago. Permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission. Speech is not well received in Congress by Republicans and certain Democrats. Those Democrats were the Dixiecrats. That's Strom Thurmond. This is Columbia, South Carolina, this Carolina capital. And that's me, a couple of years ago in Columbia, South Carolina, under the statue of Strom Thurmond. Why are you applauding Strom Thurmond? Oh, you applauding me for being under his statue. Good thing the pigeons weren't there that afternoon. Anyway, Truman faced the prospect of losing voters, the votes of the conservative southern wing of the Democratic Party, because they said, hey, we're out of here. You are embracing African-American civil rights. We don't do that in the South. We're not supporting you anymore. The Democrats, also called states' rights Democrats, or the Dixiecrats, were members of the right-wing Democratic splinter group organized by Southerners who objected to the civil rights program of the Democratic Party. At the Democratic National Convention in July, Truman's approach collapsed after pro-civil rights Democrats and anti-communist liberals from the organization American for Democratic Action won a strong civil rights plank for the party's platform. And with that, American politics begins to shift. It's a 16-year ordeal that would collapse Democratic support in the South by 1964 with Lyndon Johnson and the Civil Rights Act. And there are the Dixiecrats, Mississippi, North Carolina, Arkansas, Kentucky, all the southern states Democrats meeting in Birmingham, Alabama, July 18, 1948, and they nominate Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, the senator, or he's the governor at that time, for president, and Fielding L. Wright of Mississippi for vice president. Kind of strange at this point because here's Strom Thurmond, anti-civil rights, and yet he has a black family. He has a woman who's African American, and he's given birth to African American kids. And yet, he's out there against civil rights. Dixiecrats oppose federal regulations they consider to interfere with states' rights. The Dixiecrats were disgusted with the National Democratic Party for embracing a platform to eliminate a poll tax. By the way, do you know when Americans finally got rid of the poll tax? 1964. And passed fair labor practices and anti-lynching laws. Anti-lynching laws finally passed in 2022. And this is the executive order 9981 that Truman puts out, which desegregates the military. Since the American Revolution, African Americans had served in the military. In fact, some of them served in the Battle of the Bulge in 1944 because Eisenhower was running out of troops, so he called up black reservists or blacks who were in the Army to come over to help in the Battle of the Bulge. But almost always they were separate from white soldiers except in menial roles. This guy's the first ambassador, first African American ambassador that the United States ever had, and he goes to Liberia. His name is Edward R. Dudley, civil rights lawyer in New York in the 1940s, was appointed to the New York State's Attorney General's office. He was recruited by Thurgood Marshall to become a special assistant to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Truman sends him to Libya as a U.S. envoy and minister. Upon the elevation of the mission in Liberia to a full U.S. embassy in 1949, he was promoted to the rank of ambassador. With that, Ambassador Dudley became the first black ambassador in United States history. Libya was one of just 5 places in the State Department deemed appropriate for black diplomats. Progressives, they're still around today. End lynching, veterans want housing. Some of you, how many of you had fathers who were veterans?
What?
Fathers who were vets, who were served in World War II. You had one. You're the only one?
No.
Only
I made
one?
a mistake.
Oh, okay. Well, some of you probably grew up and were somewhat comfortable because of the GI Bill that enabled your parents to buy houses. That was come up with like in 1944, passed in 1945. In January, Truman's former Secretary of Commerce and Franklin Roosevelt's third vice president, during his third term, Henry Wallace, announced that he was going to run for president as a member of the Progressive Party in September 1946. Wallace delivers a speech critical of the Truman administration's increasingly hardline foreign policy toward the Soviet Union. Truman said, "I want your resignation." Wallace did so. He becomes a third-party candidate. He had been the darling of the left wing of the Democratic Party and threatened to rob Truman of progressive votes. Win with Wallace, Henry Wallace. Progressive Party formed in 1947 and in 1948 campaigned on changes in foreign policy. It particularly advocated more conciliatory policy toward the Soviet Union. The party warned that Americans' way of life is in danger. The root of the crisis, they claim, big business is in control of our economy and government. The final campaign, Thomas Dewey. Dewey seemed that he was going to be the victor. Truman didn't have much of a chance. Voters viewed Truman as an ineffectual shadow of Franklin Roosevelt. And he also got the Southern Democrats very upset at him because of his civil rights initiatives. Truman hits the campaign hard after Labor Day. He uses the presidential train to go across the country, gives 200 campaign speeches. Dewey was a dull speaker, and he campaigned far less. The pollsters stopped polling before Truman's whistle-stop campaign took hold. There he is on the back of the train, and he's going from city to city, and people get to see him from city to city, and he's delivering these fiery speeches. Give him hell, Harry! The Democratic revolts worked to Truman's advantage. The Dixiecrat Party, they broke off, and that reassured black voters of Truman's commitment to civil rights, which he reinforced in 1948 when he desegregated the armed forces and ended political bias or ending bias in federal employment practices. Wallace, his progressive programs supported by the Communist Party of America, and that's the problem in 1948. It's everywhere. People are trying to look for communists under any rocks that they can find. And it made Wallace, it made Truman, the attack on Truman, soft on communism, made it hard to stick. By the way, how many of you in the 1950s remember the blacklisting? Blacklisting, where actors and actresses were blacklisted along with authors. By the way, Helen Keller was blacklisted. Helen Keller was blacklisted. For his part, Truman relentlessly accused the Republican Congress of doing nothing, failing to meet the needs of the American people. And the common voter is listening. He traveled 31,000 miles across the country, gave 352 speeches, reached 3 million people. He made a campaign appearance in Harlem. In Harlem. First time a United States president had ever visited Harlem, which at that point, according to some, was the symbolic capital of Black America. Although you would have people in Atlanta saying, hey, wait a minute, what about us? Thomas Dewey was the man the polls all predicted was going to win. Guess what? He lost. Hey, I was a pundit on TV. I know how those things go. Make good TV. Doesn't matter if you make sense. Make good TV. People watch to see good TV. Dewey is a poor candidate. Stiff, aloof, self-confident, complacent. He campaigned less intensely than Truman. The actress, Ethel Barrymore, stealing Alice Roosevelt's line, said of Dewey, Dewey looks like the bridegroom on the wedding cake. Should put a wedding cake picture up there. On election day, Truman did keep enough of the traditional Democratic Solid South. He lost 4 states in the Farm Belt and the Far West. Dewey carried the Northeast, Michigan, where he grew up, Indiana, and 4 Great Plains states. Wallace wins 2% of the popular vote, but the electoral votes were widely scattered. He didn't have any. Dixiecrats candidate John Thurman, he did win 4 states. He got 39 electoral votes. That was the beginning of the end of the Democratic Party in the South. Gandhi was assassinated. The political and spiritual leader of Indian independence movement is assassinated in New Delhi by Hindu extremists. Gandhi had been a political activist and was arrested numerous times for his role in pushing India's independence. With the outbreak of World War II, Gandhi went back to politics, said India has to cooperate with the British, and if they do that, maybe we'll get independence after the war. And England quits India. Britain had refused Gandhi's assassination. Initially, Britain had refused and sought to divide India by supporting the conservative Hindus and Muslim groups. In response, Gandhi started a Quit India movement in 1942, Get the Brits Out. Gandhi and other nationalist leaders were imprisoned until 1944. But a new government comes to power in 1945 in England, Attlee replacing Churchill, and negotiations for India's independence begin. And Gandhi sought a unified India, but the Muslim League said no, and that's why you have India and Pakistan. Gandhi is assassinated. After protracted talks, Britain agreed to create 2 independent states, India and Pakistan, on August 15, 1945. Gandhi was greatly distressed by the partition. Bloody violence soon broke out between the Hindus and the Muslims in India. In an effort to end India's religious strife, he resorted to fasts and visits and visited troubled areas. On one such vigil in New Delhi, Nathram Godse, Hindu extremists who objected to Gandhi's tolerance for the Muslims, shot him. And there is the trial of Godse. Gandhi is being referred to as the father of the nation, he said. But if that's so, he has failed in his paternal duty, inasmuch he has acted very treacherously to the nation by consenting to the partition of his inner voice, his spiritual voice, his doctrine, nonviolence, of which so much is made of, proved to be powerless. The United States is still getting rid of war criminals in 1948. That's Tojo. The international military tribunals for the Far East comes to an end on November 4th. Trial ended with 25 of 28 Japanese defendants found guilty. Of the 3 other defendants, 2 died during a lengthy trial, and 1 was declared insane. On November 12th, War Crimes Tribunal passed death sentences on 7 men, including General Hideki Tojo, who served as the Japanese prime premier during the war. He was executed by hanging on December 23rd. World Health Organization is in the news virtually every day. The WHO was established on April 7th. The date it was founded, it became the Worldwide Day of Awareness, known as World Health Day. The organization is an agency of the United Nations with the primary objective researching health issues, eradicating disease like COVID-19, and promoting healthy practices worldwide. The Red Scare is in Hollywood, and the Red Scare is going after communists in Hollywood, going after all kinds of people in Hollywood. It starts in 1946 when a guy by the name of Billy Wilkerson, who owned the Hollywood Reporter, also an editor and publisher, started to expose communists working in Hollywood. The alleged Reds would be named in his trade view columns, exposing the lurking menace. On July 29th, he publishes trade views. Includes the names of Dalton Trumbo and Howard Koch and 9 others who are communist sympathizers. Wilkinson would go on and ruin careers. But he tried to ruin careers too. Walt Disney with Mickey Mouse. 1941, gets a hold of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and he says, some of my former animators are communists, and the Screen Actors Guild was a communist front, and labeled the 1941 strike that hit the studio a communist plot. He even contacted the FBI about communist infiltration. Ronald Reagan goes up to Washington the first time in 1947, the House on Un-American Activities, and tells the committee, yeah, there are some communists here. But Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, Gene Kelly, John Huston signed a petition saying the fact that Reagan is up there is totally un-American in itself, because America is not supposed to be probing the politics of individual citizens. And Reagan would say, yeah, there's a small clique of communists that have been a disruptive influence within the Screen Actors Guild, of which he was president. The Hollywood 10, there were some of the guys who were blackballed. In November 1947, 10 screenwriters and directors refused to testify before the House committee, arguing the First Amendment. The U.S. Constitution guaranteed the freedom to belong to any political organization they chose. 10, Alvy Besson, Herbert Biberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dimitri, Ring Lardner Jr., I know his son Rex, who lives out in Chicago, John Howard Lawson, Albert Mouse, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, Dalton Trumbo, who wrote Spartacus. Remember the movie Spartacus? That's what he wrote. Congress didn't see it that way, though. Didn't see it at all. And they told the guys, you know what, we're citing you for contempt. And they were found guilty on contempt charges. Spent a year in jail, $1,000 fine. You could go to jail for contempt of Congress. You could. Apartheid in South Africa picks up, beware of natives. National Party gains power in South Africa in 1948. Its all-white government immediately began enforcing existing policies of racial segregation under apartheid. Non-white South Americans, the majority of the population, would be forced to live in separate areas from the whites and use separate public facilities. Contact between the two groups would be limited. Right here on our stage, how many of you used to watch the Ed Sullivan Show every Sunday night? No? You never did? You watch Bonanza, Car 54, Where Are You? How many of you watch Ed Sullivan? Did you like Sullivan? Did you like him? Or did you like the guests on his show?
Yes,
The guests on the show. I'm going to give you a Jerry Stiller story. Jerry is my cousin. He and Ann are on the show 36 times. And Anna Marie Alberghetti is on the show one night. And Anna Marie Alberghetti is on Broadway, and Sunday night Broadway is dark, so Ed invites her down to sing the big song from whatever show she was in. And so she sings the song, and Ed is listening to the applause, which is, yeah, no big deal. Said, come on, come on, come on, come on, let's hear it, let's hear it, let's hear it. Let's hear it for Ave Maria. Ave Maria. Ed Sullivan was a newspaper reporter. He was born in Port Chester, New York in 1902. He also covered sports for a variety of New York newspapers until 1931. 1932, he starts writing features about Broadway. And the New York Daily News hires him as a columnist. His Little Old New York is the column. And it's on all aspects of the city. Beginning in the late 1920s, Sullivan hosted some radio shows. Irving Berlin, Jack Benny, Jimmy Durante made their radio debuts on the Ed Sullivan radio show. He's the toast of the town. So he's the toast of the town. By the 1940s, he's hosting Ed Sullivan Presents from the 21 Club, where Barbara Walters' father was a maitre d' at one point. Anyway, he begins to accept offers to MC reviews at theaters in Manhattan, which leads him to hosting additional events. CBS hires Ed Sullivan to host a weekly show, a new format combining vaudeville with television. And its nickname, Vaudeville. Its television show is called Toast of the Town. Ed Sullivan was a man who couldn't sing, dance, or spin plates, or entertain. I love plate spinners. Remember the plate spinners? They were great. I'd give anything to watch a good plate spinner today. I don't think they do it anymore. But Sullivan looked bad. He looked pasty in bright lights. He was shifty in his stance. He bungled introductions and monologues. Fred Allen, remember Fred Allen, the comedian? Fred Allen once said, Ed Sullivan will be around as long as someone else has talent. And he was right. The first show. Martin and Lewis are on the first show. And also Rodgers and Hammerstein, a pianist, a ballerina, crooning fireman, a boxing referee. His next gig was the Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott match. He had something for everybody. If you ever looked at the shows, particularly when I grew up in the 1960s, you'd have something for kids, something for teenagers, something for young adults, something for married adults with kids, something for married adults who are empty nesters, and something for senior citizens. He had it all. He had everything. But the critics were rough on Sullivan. They lambasted him. He was wooden. But the show would do well anyway. That's my friend, the late Bob Block. That's a picture 10 years ago. He was good friends with Henny Youngman. Remember Henny Youngman? Take My Wife, Please? Henny Youngman died a bitter man. You're going to hear the story as to why he died a bitter man. There were 44,000 television sets in use in 1947. There were 2 million sets in American homes in 1948, 720,000 in New York City alone. In 1948, the FCC froze awarding new licenses because they couldn't keep up with the licenses, and also they didn't know if TV signals were going to interfere with each other. There were 30 stations in 19 states, just 4 cities outside the Mississippi, including western Mississippi, including Los Angeles. 4 networks, ABC, CBS, Dumont, and ABC, no TV in Canada. Remember Henny Youngman? Remember Henny Youngman, king of the one-liners? And he was rapid fire, king of the one-liners. He died a bitter man. Why? He should have been Mr. Television. But he turned in a chance to try out for a radio show that was moving to TV. Why? Well, let me ask you a question. if you have a choice, knowing that there are very few TV shows around, and you are from England, which he is, do you do the royal performance in front of Princess Elizabeth, or do you take a chance on a TV show that nobody might ever watch? What would you do? Would you perform for Princess Elizabeth, or would you do this TV show that maybe nobody will watch? What would you do? How many of you would have gone and performed before Princess Elizabeth? You would? How many of you would take a chance on an unknown medium like TV? You would. Well, his agent says, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You do what you're going to do. Takes the London gig. And he gives up the Texaco Star Theater. And Bob Watts said that he was bitter because his friend Milton Berle became Mr. Television. He could have been Mr. TV. June 8th, 4 singing Texaco servicemen introduced Milton Berle as the first TV host of the Texaco Star Theater. Question for you. How many of you remember the Texaco Star Theater? You can trust your car to the man who wore the star, the big, bright Texaco Star. It was a show that started with Fred Allen on radio, except Fred Allen had a face made for radio. Berle was supposed to alternate with several other hosts, including Henny Youngman. But, hey, he got a lot of fan mail. And all of a sudden, he is the host of the show, the Texaco Star Theater. He dominated all the competition, 90% of TV sets on while that show was airing. We're in for Uncle Milty. When the show was on the air, movie theaters across the United States wouldn't be open. They'd be shut. Closed tonight to watch Milton Berle. This guy here, Larry Strickler, and that's his wife Shelley, who used to be on WOR radio. That's up at Cutcher's. They used to speak at Cutcher's. He was a child actor on the Milton Berle show, How They Do the Show, and he ended up becoming a guidance counselor for high school. Anyway, we were talking about that one day, and I said, why did the show work? He said, because Berle was a perfectionist. Henny Youngman would not have had the success on that show like Milton Berle did, because Milton Berle was just better at it, just a lot better at it. How many of you have seen this movie, A Gentleman's Agreement? Like it? You like it?
I remember.
Okay, well, then we're
seeing it, but I don't remember.
going to talk about it now. Gentleman's Agreement, when journalist Phil Green, played by Gregory Peck, moves to New York City, he takes a high-profile magazine assignment about anti-Semitism. In order to truly view things from an empathetic perspective, he pretends to be a Jew and begins to experience many forms of bigotry in the city and in Connecticut, Darien, Connecticut, both firsthand and through a Jewish friend, Dave Goldman, played by John Garfield, who I believe's name was Julius Garfinkel. Released on November 7th, 1947 in New York, in 1948, it was nominated for 8 Oscars and won 3. Best Picture, Best Supporting Actress, Celeste Holm, Best Director, Elia Kazan. The movie was an unexpected hit at the box office. According to Variety, it did almost $4 million in rentals in 1948. House on Un-American Activities wanted to know a little more about Gentleman's Agreement because it didn't put some people in a good light. The political nature of Gentleman's Agreement apparently upset the House on Un-American Committee with Elia Kazan, Daryl Zanuck, and John Garfield, and Anne Revere being called to testify before the committee. Revere said, I'm not coming. Garfield did appear, but he's not naming names because they thought the movie was a communist front. Both were placed on the red channels of the Hollywood blacklist. Garfield remained on the blacklist for a year, was called again to testify against his wife Roberta, and suddenly died of a heart attack before the second hearing. Roberta Garfield was briefly a member of the Communist Party. Babe Ruth died. That picture taken by a guy who lived over in Piermont, Nat Fine, who I knew when I was 23 years old. He had a photography studio around here. That picture won a Pulitzer Prize, last time Babe Ruth in uniform at Yankee Stadium. It's August 16th. He dies from cancer in New York City. He hits 60 home runs in 1927. Led the Yankees to 7 pennants. In 1935, he retired after hitting 714 career home runs. The big sports event was the Harlem Globetrotters against the Minneapolis Lakers. Abe Saperstein's Harlem Globetrotters, based in Chicago. Abe Saperstein was never in Harlem, but he named the team the Globetrotters. Bigger than the Basketball Association of America or the National Basketball League. In 1940, the Globers won the World Professional Basketball Tournament. Its brand was well known and marketable. On February 19th, the Globetrotters take on the Minneapolis Lakers. First game of the doubleheader in Chicago Stadium. Second game, the Knicks playing the Chicago Stags, thought to be the main game, but 17,823 people show up for the Globies game, a world record to watch a basketball game at that point. And it was the Globetrotters against the Lakers. The Lakers weren't in the Basketball Association of America, so it was just an exhibition game. It featured Goose Tatum and Marquise Haynes from the Globetrotters. Lakers had George Mikan. The Globetrotters played legit, won the game. Two things came out of this game. Record crowd and Negro players could play basketball. The BAA had a color barrier, except for one Japanese-American player by the name of Wat Masika. The NBL had black players in 1942. How many of you used to listen to music on the long-playing record? The 33. How many of you had the hi-fi phonographs, all that other stuff? You didn't have the phonograph? You were deprived. You couldn't listen to Jerry Vale. You were deprived. This is an orchestra. June 21st, Columbia Records, a micro-groove plastic double-sided 12-inch 33 1/3 LP. Debuts in New York. 17 minutes of music on each side. Mendelssohn Violin Concerto in E minor, and Bruno Walter conducting the New York Philharmonic were on there. How many of you owned one of these, the Polaroid Land camera? They were expensive. They were expensive. That's a model of the camera that went on sale November 26th. You were right, they were expensive. They sold for $89.95, which would be $960 today, which is more than the cost of, it's more than the cost of this. It's named after Edwin Land, who developed a process for self-developing photography. It was the Model 95 and had sepia-colored prints. How many of you ate at McDonald's? You deserve a break today. McDonald's, 1948. The brothers, Richard and Maurice, opened the restaurant in San Bernardino, California. After they closed their existing restaurants to concentrate on the items that sold the most, hamburgers. The first self-serving McDonald's, self-service McDonald's, sold hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, soft drinks, and milkshakes. They haven't changed the menu much, have they? The 1948 legacy. Egypt and Israel have a peace treaty, but tensions remain high in the Middle East. Been 5 wars. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982. North Korea did invade South Korea in 1950, the U.S. and North Korea. Korean War over, yes or no? Is the Korean War over, yes or no? The answer is no. A treaty has never been signed. It's been a truce. It is the longest war in American history, technically. Even though the truce was signed in 1953, it's now 72 years old. There's Harry Truman, who won, but he bowed out in the 1952 race. He had nearly 8 years in office by that point, filled with turbulence, Cold War in Korea. Strom Thurmond's presidential bid was the canary in the coal mine, warning of the rebellion by white voters in the South against the Democratic Party, especially against its civil rights program. It took 6 years to fully desegregate the Army. 1954, the deactivation of the 94th Engineer Battalion, the Army's last all-black unit, completed the process. Goodsey, November 15, 1949, and his partner in crime, Narayan Apte, were both hanged for Gandhi's murder. That's Yalta, 1945, February of 45, and the legacy of that Yalta meeting. The Soviet Union would fall in 1991. Problems remain between the United States and Russia. Czechoslovakia invaded by the Soviets in 1965 during the Prague Spring. Czechoslovakia split into two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1994. Yugoslavia broke apart in 1991-1992. Apartheid ends in South Africa in 1994. World Health Organization is still around. Oh, these guys are still around, believe it or not. Heck, Paul and Ringo are still on tour. Paul's going to be 80 years old in about a month. Ringo is going to be 82 on July 7th, and they're still out there. That was the Ed Sullivan Show. Texaco Star Theater, largely credited with driving American television sales. The number of TVs sold during Milton Berle's run on the show from 1948 to 1956 went from 500,000 to over 30 million. Sullivan lasted 23 years. He introduced the Beatles to America, put African Americans on this program when it was an unpopular thing to do. Many of the Hollywood 10 continued to write. Robert Rich, that's the pseudonym for Dalton Trumbo, who wrote the script The Brave One, which won him the best screenplay, 1957. The blacklisting ended in 1960. Gentleman's Agreement was a groundbreaking film. The Harlem Globetrotters brand has faded. The NBA is now worth billions of dollars. These have faded away, these old mobile gas pumps. This is up in Cannondale, Connecticut. Babe Ruth is still regarded as the greatest baseball player of all time. Technologies come and go, but the long-playing record is still around. The Polaroid land camera sold well for years. And the McDonald brothers cut a deal with a Chicago salesman by the name of Ray Kroc. The McDonald's franchise was launched in 1955. Any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours.
Thank you, very interesting.
How many of you remember this stuff?
I won't, but it was wonderful when I...
Thank you.
What she said.
She said it was wonderful.